Welcome back, everyone, to The Nerd Out. Joining with Jack. How are you doing this morning?
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
Enjoying this fall weather?
Yes.
That's at some point coming.
It's eventually going to get here.
Yes.
Totally. It's beginning. I think we're in the 90s now. So
yeah, that's fall in Arizona.
Yes.
Anything below 100.
Yeah, that's true. We're under the century mark.
Yes. Well, we are covering the last chapter of Philippians.
We are.
Chapter
We
4.
finally made it there.
Yes. It's been a great series. Before we get into chapter 4, the sermon title is Joyful. And we've talked in the past of like why that is so important for us, our church, to go through right now. But elaborate a little bit again, just remind us like why is joyful what captures this series?
Yeah. 16 different times Paul uses the word rejoice or joy in this text, in this book. And he's trying to call us to something that goes beyond our circumstance, beyond our situation. Because again, remember, he's writing this from under house arrest. We actually showed a picture a couple weeks back of just where most archaeologists and early Christians from the 5th century believe where this was. Obviously, we weren't there, but we're pretty close to where he was. And so house arrest was not living in a villa on the sea, enjoying the scenery. It was kind of this underground dungeon where you had to be lowered down into it, chained to guards. And he's writing yet in the midst of his suffering about this joy that can hold him and help him. And he's wanting the church and the people of the church, and especially the people in Philippi, to experience and hold on to that. And this is a text that I think speaks to us some 1,500 years later, that in our own circumstances, maybe seasons of suffering, we can still experience the beauty of joy that we find in Jesus. That's why we can rejoice in the Lord, even if our circumstances aren't always joyful or filled with joy.
And so a couple weeks we've talked about just, Paul being in prison, the suffering he's had. Some of the other themes throughout Philippians is all about unity. And that part of that fellowship of suffering, that koinonia with the Lord, but also with each other. And thinking back to chapter 2 about just the unity of the church.
Right.
Chapter 4 starts off bold, Paul addressing some disunity in the church.
Yeah, he calls out a couple people. Their names make it in the Bible. And he's saying to these two ladies, hey, you've got to figure it out, work it out, which I think for sometimes... And maybe that's a flashback before we get here of the unity is, when we go through seasons of suffering, it's okay to remember that the biblical writers, Jesus himself, we live in such a sitcom drama-like reality where we feel like everything's got to be resolved in 30 minutes. And the reality is seasons of suffering and seasons of joy don't all get resolved. Tension is a part of reality of life. And so sometimes we make progress in the fellowship of the sufferings, in going through our own seasons of turmoil, but they're not necessarily always resolved quickly, easily, or with a bow on it and made all neat. And so I think he's even speaking to these two ladies, hey, there's been this growing tension, work it out. And bring it to a place of resolution, because then he even writes to the rest of the church in Philippi, help them do this. And so it's because these two people are very dear to him. He's talked about how they've partnered with him in ministry in the past, and so he doesn't want to see that tension continue to be there. So it may not get resolved overnight, but he wants to see resolution come. And so he calls them out. And their names are forever recorded in the scripture. So maybe I'm grateful that Paul's not writing a letter about me, because I don't want to make it in there that way. But
I mean, everybody will struggle with tensions in the church, but I do find it interesting that it is women that are in strife a little bit with this. I think that's a little bit more, I don't know. there's just something comical to me about that. Women are finally addressed, and it is sort of in this dramatic light.
Work out the drama.
Yeah, but I also think having just like you said, he also commends everybody like help them with it. So it is a whole church responsibility to come and make sure that everyone is walking in unity. And so Paul continues in Philippians to, I think, one of the most well-known passages in, for sure, the book of Philippians, but I would almost say in almost all of the
New
Bible,
Testament,
is this whole section of Scripture. Why do you think that is so? Why is that so true? Why do we remember this particular passage so well?
Well, he does say the word rejoice twice in a row, real quick. The idea of rejoice, I say it again, rejoice. And he's driving home. Hey, joy is this anchor that's meant to hold you. And then he kind of gets into don't be anxious about anything. And if we know anything about anything, anxiety is a reality of people, of humanity. Not just, we talk about I've read The Anxious Generation. I forget the author of that book, but I just finished reading it. And it talks about anxiety being an all-time high, but in our current moment of history. But the reality is anxiety has been around ever since the brokenness of humanity and the fallenness of humanity. And so anxiety has its way of rearing its head. And so he's trying to address the truth that every human, because you're human, will wrestle with anxiety. And so he's trying to help us understand, okay, when you get anxious, what do you do with that? And so I think that might be why this is such a popular understanding or passage that people refer to all the time.
Because it's so relatable, because we bring our anxieties and it kind of colors so much of our worldview and things. And yet Paul says, rejoice in the Lord. Like that's really the antidote, rejoicing, and then, continuing the verse of letting your requests be known and prayer with thankfulness. Like all those things are all the antidotes to your anxiety. Can you elaborate a little bit more on?
He talks about, he sets it up with rejoice in the Lord always. I'll say it again, rejoice. Let your graciousness be evident to all. The Lord is near. So I actually think that part is the part that is the anchoring. It's because of the proximity of the presence of Jesus that's with you in all things. Now you don't have to be anxious. Do not be anxious about anything, but with prayer and petition, present your request to God, and the peace of God that will stand guard over your heart. It's literally the peace of God. When he talks about that, you got to picture like a samurai warrior, because the Greek language is this idea of a warrior standing guard over your heart. That anxiety that's bubbling up within you doesn't have to be something that is constantly present. It will constantly come across, but it doesn't have to stay in residence within you. So it's like I heard someone say, we're the air traffic controllers of our mind. You can't control every plane, every thought that flies by, but you can control what lands and what disembarks and sets up residence. And so anxiety will be a part of life that we all deal with the ups and downs and the stresses that come. But we don't have to let it reside within us, because we can remember that the Lord is near. He is with us. He is for us. We can find our joy in him, and he walks with us through every and each circumstance that we navigate. And so though anxiety might be a part of the reality for people, it doesn't have to be something that disembarks and sets up residence in your life to the point that it's the only thing that you can see. Now, I know for some folks that might have a more might be predisposed, so to speak, to wrestle with that a little bit more. And there may be some chemical imbalances in who you are and how you're wired together. And I think it's important. I think healthy people seek out counsel. unhealthy people hide. It's the old adage that sometimes I remember when I was a kid, and we had a pool in our backyard, and sometimes we'd play the game where you could take the beach ball and you try to hold it under the water, and you try to keep it under the water for as long as you can, and you're competing against your friend to do that. And for a lot of people, when they face anxiety, maybe that's how they kind of deal with it. They just kind of shove it down and say, okay, I'm going to ignore that, or I'm not going to deal with that. And yet what Paul's saying in the scripture is, say, when you face that, remember the Lord is near, and pray about it. If it's enough to worry about it, then it's enough to pray about. And you're able to bring that to the Lord. It's a very invitational kind of language that invites us into this relationship, because what has Paul been saying this whole time? Part of the goal is to know Christ and to walk with him, and that you can bring anything and everything to him. It's what we see in the psalmist, that when you read through the Psalms, there's no hidden emotion there. Every aspect and facet of emotion is laid bare, that the psalmist can bear their soul to God, and God doesn't run away. He's not offended. He's not shocked. He actually knows what's going on before you know what's going on. And so you're not going to catch him off guard. You're not going to teeter him a little bit in his throne. He is sovereign over all that. And he allows us to pour out our soul and actually invites us to do so.
I think part of what he's driving at too is like, it is in the mind. Like, I think about in Romans 12, where he talks about like, you'll be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Like the mind is where we are attacked. Like that's where the enemy wants to get in and make you doubt or question, or what's breeding anxiety. And so, I think part of the benefit of prayer and letting your request be known to the Lord is really taking inventory of the thoughts that are coming in, the ones that are waging war. Like what are you bringing to the Lord in prayer? And as far as the petitions and things unto the Lord is, it starts in your mind, where your thoughts are, and what are you bringing?
What you're simmering on.
Yeah, what you're allowing to let in, what you're allowing to simmer and sit with. And I think part of that prayer time is just this release. I think when you talk about the peace of God, it is this release of the anxiety and the tension that's just constantly on the forefront. With prayer, so Paul's talking about the invitation to let your request be made known, but he goes on and adds a couple things to that. What are those?
Well, I'm going to have to look it up.
Thanksgiving is one of the ones that comes to mind. Like letting your request be made known to the Lord with thanksgiving, which I think especially, I know for me, whenever I'm the most anxious, I'm also probably one of the most selfish people, because that's all I can think about. And I think part of that, being thankful is also just being grateful with the circumstances, and not holding my selfishness in mind.
I think that's one of the things they talk about is they being leaders and other leaders that I follow, the idea of a gratitude journal. Sometimes if you're feeling anxious or finding yourself dealing with anxiety, maybe it's a good, and prayer isn't always, I have to formulate and set up and get still and quiet and lower every distraction. Sometimes prayer is just, okay, God, I'm really stressed. Like I can feel it intrinsically in my body. When you're feeling anxious, and we all know what that feels like, let that be a trigger for you to go, okay, I got to pray. I get to pray. And now I'm going to bring my request to you, God. I'm not going to be the only one that's dealing with this in my own mind. And so, God, I'm anxious about X, whatever that might be. And I'm feeling it. And so I want to bring that to you. And at the same time, I want to maybe take stock of just how you've been, I want to be thankful of how you've been present in my life throughout time. So whether you've been walking with the Lord for 3 months And you can think back over the last 3 months of here's how God's shown up. Here's how he's shown himself to be faithful. Or you've been walking with Jesus for 30 years. Well, then you have a lot more to pull from. You got a deeper well to pull from of, okay, here's how God's shown up in my past. And if you can write down your anxiety, sometimes it may help you to actually write it out. Here's the things that are capturing my attention. Here's the things that are stirring up underneath the surface that I don't want to talk about with other people, or I can't go to sleep, or I'm waking up at night. I went through a season a few years back where literally I could not sleep past 2 a.m. Like at 2 a.m. I was waking up and anxious and worried. And I started just kind of writing in my journal, okay, why am I worried about X, Y, Z? And I would just write those out. I would try to practice gratitude. I had a song on repeat when I was walking in the morning that literally it was all about how we wage war with praise. And I listened to that song probably for the 50 minutes of my walk, I don't know, 10, 11 times, because I was just trying to retrain my mind to say, I don't have to be the one to carry this. God can be the heavy lifter. He hasn't asking me to bear the burden of all creation, or the creation of my own mind and my own anxious thoughts. I can bring this to him, and he can be the heavy lifter of that along with me. And I have participation in it, but I have a small participation part. He has to be the heavy lifter of that.
I think one of the things that is so disheartening about anxiety is you feel so alone in it. You feel
Totally
like you are, especially as a believer. I know for me, like I always feel like I'm doing something wrong if I have this anxiety, or that that there's something unusual or different that's that's causing this. And so I think part of the call is normalizing it. Where else in Scripture do we see anxiety? In other leaders in the church, Jesus himself. Like I can think of just different examples of anxiety presented in Scriptures.
I think you'll find times anxiety can be also, Steve Cuffs talks about, it's a reactivity also. And so we see a reactivity in the lives of people who are anxious. And so James and John, who are reacting to, they're trying to cut through a little village in Samaria, and the people aren't wanting them to come. They're like, should we call down fire from heaven? And it's a reactivity to try to go drastic. And what you see in the life of Jesus is a calm presence. And so when you see a lot of reactivity, or you have a lot of reactivity going on, that should be a warning light to you that you've got some anxiety probably happening internally that maybe you haven't even voiced yet. And so it's recognizing that, okay, A, have I prayed about this? B, am I even recognizing it? And then C, what he talks about through Philippians is how the community is meant to help bear the burdens of one another. And so do you have one or two safe people in your e-group or other believers that you can say, hey, would you pray with me? And enlist some other people to be part of prayer support. And prayer support in a lot of ways from a military perspective is we give air support when there's wars and things going on in order to help people on the ground. And prayer support's kind of the same thing. It's you got other people who are praying for you as you're going through the trenches of dealing with the anxiety that's welling up in you. Do you have one or two other people that you can enlist to help with the prayer support? So again, as a church, we believe in the power of prayer. Right in our app, you've got the prayer request things that you can fill out a prayer request and send that in. Our elder team, our prayer team sees that, and we want to pray for you, that you're not alone in dealing with the different things that you're walking through. And that's, I think, one of the things we're trying to foster as a church community is that you don't have to be alone. And feeling alone, we know that's probably tactic number one for the enemy, that, First Peter talks about that beware your enemy is like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. And I remember driving through Estes Park one time with my family and a few other ministry leaders, and we're in a 15-passenger van, and a deer comes shooting across the street, and all of a sudden you see 4 or 5 other wolves that are chasing this deer, and it's because it got separated from the herd. And so you're literally watching Wildlife Kingdom come to life right outside the window of the van, and my girls are like, "This is crazy." And the truth is, that's how the enemy loves to work. He loves to isolate people, get them alone in feeling, in dealing with their anxiety or the things they're struggling with. And so community is such a huge antidote or counterpart to that, of what the church can be and can bring to help people. So I know it takes courage and vulnerability to share when you don't want to share, when you're struggling. But I know personally that as I've done that with my covenant group that I'm a part of with some other pastors, as I've done that with our staff, as I've done that with people in our e-group, there's just a sense of support that you get. I think that's part of the release of the peace of God will stand guard over your heart. It's not just an internal peace that kind of rests on you. When you realize you're not alone and you got other people in your corner, there's a sense of God's peace that gets released through others in the midst of that we get to tangibly feel and see and experience. I don't know about for you, if you've experienced that as you've gone through different things.
Absolutely. And I mean, for me, anytime that I've been anxious and have just been for me, it's been overwhelming at times where it's like it's all, that's the focal point for me. And it's really hard. You just feel stuck or stagnant when I've felt anxiety. And so being able to be surrounded by individuals, I know one individual is always encouraging me, like, preach to yourself, like, you know the truth. And so being able to just say like having somebody who will say like, no, like what that thought is irrational. Preach to yourself. Remember whose you are and what the goal is. And so for me, just having a body of believers around me is essential. Because again, it is so isolating. It feels so, you feel so alone and abnormal, and like you don't belong in the church, you don't belong in the world, you don't belong. And so I think like anytime that you can come and recognize, put words to the thought, like really identify the source of that anxiety. It's not just I'm stressed or I'm anxious. Like, what is it that's causing it? Like finding the root problem, I think, isn't the other piece of this, is like being able to really recognize what is the underlying source that is causing you to doubt or question.
Yeah.
But yeah, the peace that comes with that, when you just you feel this overwhelming sense of freedom, where you're no longer held captive by the thoughts. It is supernatural. It is divine peace that surpasses all understanding. Like there is something beautiful and just divine about that kind of peace with God, the peace of God. Like there's just so much, just this, I don't know, this weird peace that comes.
It's a tangible and yet an intangible peace that kind of rests on you, that God can bring. And the same way that anxiety has a way, I don't know if you have felt this, but sometimes when I'm anxious about one thing, it can quickly escalate to 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 things that I think are overwhelming. And it almost feels like an emotional landslide, that it's everything in life is a mess. Everything in life is. And so sometimes if you feel that sense of like dread or that sense of like a landslide emotionally, I have found it helpful to actually begin to write out, okay, what am I anxious about? And kind of that name it to claim it type thing, or name it to tame it, in the sense of, okay, here's what I'm actually anxious about. And maybe these other things, again, I think a tactic of the enemy is to try to well up things that are in a lot of ways, I you can see it with movies or so, where a shadow is really big, and yet when you zoom back out, it's a really small thing. And if you can write it down, sometimes even just seeing it can visualize and begin to see, okay, what I thought was this huge shadow of something is actually, it's actually pretty smaller than I thought. And I don't want the enemy to make it feel bigger than what it really is. And when I can rally other people around me and trust myself, be vulnerable to that. I know I'm processing with friends, with my e-group, processing with a counselor at times. Then that begins to shrink the shadow of it and the impact of what it can be. And that peace of God can begin to reside, and for him and his peace and his joy to take up more residence. It doesn't mean I still don't have the issues, or I still don't have the struggles or the tension that comes with that. And I can still feel a twinge of anxiety at times. Part of a twinge of anxiety sometimes can be, that's part of our fight or flight syndrome. And so that's not always necessarily a bad thing. And so it's not that we need to get rid of all anxiety, but the crippling kind of anxiety, the anxiety that can cast a shadow over your life that tends to bring you toward isolation, or push you toward isolation, or push you toward someone of forgetting who your identity in Christ, forgetting who you are to God and how important you are to him. I think that's why it's important to preach to yourself. It's important to have vulnerability with others. It's important to maybe begin to name it, to tame it. It's important to seek out wise counsel. And we can get to the place of remembering, okay, the Lord is near. He's not far. He's not distracted. He's actually dialed into me, and he's with me. He's for me. He's not against me. And so you start telling yourself the truth over and over and over. Maybe it's finding a good worship song that speaks to that, and just putting it on repeat for a little while if that's a season of struggle that you're in. I know that served me well, going through a season of that. I know other tips or things that you've learned in dealing with it.
I mean, you've hit several of them already of journaling. I know for me, being able to see my own handwriting and seeing that thought illuminated to me has been incredibly powerful. Worship, spending time with other believers, and just hearing what other people have struggled with. It just there's something about that vulnerability in community that is powerful, because it's like, just it normalizes it. There's a breath to it. Anything I'm a psychology major, so anything cognitive behavioral therapy. There's so many different strategies in that have been very, very helpful to me. And I think just going back to, Paul's antidote of prayer. I think we think of this as so often mystic, and yet no, it's for me, it's been very practical of Paul says, in everything. Right. I know with anxiety, I always feel this is too big for God. I can't bring this to God, or this is too small for God. And it's it's in everything. He delights in it. He wants there to be, he wants to hear it all. Right. And so I think part of that is it really prayer is an antidote that is often overlooked, because I know for me, the fear of it's too big for even God.
Right. Well, and again, prayer is about communing and connecting with God. Prayer is not trying to make God aware of what's going on. He already knows. He's inviting us to pray about it so that we can actually connect over it, and he can relate with me and I can relate with him. I can be regrounded into who he says I am. I can be regrounded into the reality that he is near. And therefore that I can live in the gracious presence of his nearness, and that can help calm the fears and anxieties that will surface and will come. But they don't have to determine the trajectory of my life. They don't have to be this landslide that overwhelms. That when I feel that, again, if it's small enough to worry about, it's small enough to pray about. If it's big enough to worry about, it's big enough to pray about. And prayer is about communing with God and allowing Him to let His peace find rest in you again. And that's the invitation.
And there's also a big theological word that Paul uses too about supplication in this passage, and just like it's not just letting a request be made known, but it's with prayer, petition, and supplication. Which what does that mean for believers, and how should that shape our prayer life?
Well, supplication in a lot of ways is coming alongside and presenting the request of others, and you're asking for God's intervention. You're seeking God's intervention in that, and so you're bringing Him into not the idea of, okay, I'm going to solve this. It's God, I need your help in solving this, and I need your help in helping us begin to find ways of resourcing and experiencing this, and finding that hope in the other channels that maybe he's connected and has access to. But it's realizing I can leave it at his feet and rest it upon him.
I like that. Because I think part of that anxiety is also this, I don't know, that you're anxious for other people.
Correct.
And so part of that supplication is that intercessory prayer of like praying on behalf of somebody
that prayer
else.
Support.
So I think that's incredibly valuable. Paul concludes the passage with finally, which he's never finished, just like pastors.
Yeah,
finally,
that's
in
true.
conclusion,
In
they never
closing,
really
yeah.
are. But Paul, finally, my brethren, gives us 8 things to think about, and goes through like whatever is, noble, whatever is praiseworthy,
Right.
whatever is good. Think about these things.
These things. Which is part of the counteraction to anxiety, because anxiety has this way of trying to fog up your mind, and it becomes the only thing that you can see. It's like if you ever go to a concert and they inject a bunch of, do they call it fog?
Haze.
So they inject that in, and it kind of shades everything. What he's saying is, okay, let's counteract that with all these things. And he lists 8, let your mind dwell on these things, and it'll actually help repel some of the anxiety that might be trying to upstage you in life. And so it's the counteractive pull of what am I dwelling on? And the enemy wants me to dwell here in anxiety, and God's saying, no, you don't have to, because I'm near. And so, yes, when it surfaces, bring it to me, pray for others, be prayer support for them. But at the same time, let your mind rest here and dwell on these things.
Yeah. I think that's part of also be thinking about what you think about. But the things that are coming into your mind, are those hitting those 8 things too? Like, I think the things that we bring into our mind, are we listening to things that are good and praiseworthy? Are we watching, things that are noble and true? Are we surrounded by friends that are living a life of truth? Like, I think part of the inventory of our own thoughts are also the outlets around us. Is a good encouragement for folks. As Paul finishes this particular section, he gives this statement of like the things that you have learned and seen in me practice. It kind of reminds me again in 1 Corinthians, where he talks about like imitate me as I imitate Christ. Paul does this very well. We've talked about him being in house arrest and being imprisoned, and yet he's rejoicing in the Lord always. And so we can see his example to be able to imitate and to put those things into practice.
Right. Yeah, he's a great example. In fact, if you don't mind, I'm just going to read what he says. Finally, brothers and sisters, so it's an all skate for everybody. Whatever's true, whatever's honorable, whatever's just, whatever's pure, whatever's lovely, whatever's commendable, if there's anything of moral excellence, if there's anything praiseworthy, dwell on these things. Do what you've learned and received and heard from me and seen in me, and God's peace will be with you. And so, again, he's not saying, because he said this earlier in chapter 3, I've not arrived. But man, he's really blazing a trail, especially someone who's going through the circumstances he's gone through and is in the midst of. And again, part of this, he's writing back to this church that sent Epaphroditus with support and with food and with gifts to help him in a pretty dire situation that without that would have been pretty traumatic. But with that, really helped lift his spirits. And so he's seeing that. He's living this out. And now he's writing back to this church saying, hey, I may be in a rough situation and you know about it, but I'm beginning to try to think about what I think about. And I want you to do the same. Because I can rejoice in the Lord even here. And you can rejoice where you're at too.
Amen. I think as the other closing thought is, not only do we get the peace of God that surpasses understanding, but at the very end, he says, the God of peace will be with you. So we get the closeness and the dearness of the Lord, that he is indeed near, that we have the God of peace with us. So for all of the e-groups out there, maybe just spend some time in prayer with one another, wrestling through these things, and we will see you all next week.